whatever they want to reveal. But I will say this. You do know that my friend, Dr. Anna Beavis, is going to be here, and she is from Johns Hopkins, and she is a gynecologic oncologist, but she was not there. She was not there during Henrietta Lacks, and so she has come on knowing very well the history that we are going to be speaking about. She knows very well a lot of the emotion that is still attached to it, and she is here to really give us an understanding from a medical point of view, what has happened, what the impact of Henrietta Lacks is having, and what is going on within the world of gynecology and gynecologic oncology. So I just wanted to let you guys know that before I introduce everyone, because I'm about to make the introductions. But if we can all agree that we're all here in love and light, and to really engage and to learn more. So with that, I'll say welcome. And with that, I am going to provide these slides as still letting people in. So hold on just 1 second and we will get in. Okay. And in case you're wondering why I'm stopping, because more and more people are coming in. We actually had over 100 people, almost 150 people that actually registered for tonight. So it's a lot of folks. All righty. And I'm sharing my screen. Let me get it all over here. Forgive me. I'm trying to get my screen working. Forgive me. Let me stop sharing for a second and get this straight. All right. I'm working with a new computer. So here I go with the slideshow. Okay. And we're going to start in the beginning. Okay. I am now ready. Can you see all of this? Are you able to see it?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Do you want to be in presentation mode or
I am. I do want to be in presentation mode.
Okay.
And yes. As long as everyone can see it, we're good, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. All righty. So we are starting with, I want to again welcome you. And as I mentioned briefly, Dr. Anna Beavis is here with us. Dr. Beavis is a gynecologic oncologist at Johns Hopkins, and she's also a professor there. She went to medical school at Keck School of Medicine in Southern California, at the University of Southern California, where she had a residency at UCLA. And she then came to Johns Hopkins to complete her Gyn-Onc Fellowship, during which she also has earned her MPH, her Master's of Public Health, from the Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She currently splits her time between her clinical care with her patients, and she's conducting research in the classroom. So welcome to Dr. Beavis. And we also have Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander. She is the Endowed Professor of Virginia Black History and Culture, Emeritus Director of the Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for the Study of the African Diaspora, and former Dean of the College of Liberal Arts at Norfolk State University right here in Virginia. She is the author of Virginia Waterways and the Underground Railroad, an African-American history of the Civil War in Hampton Roads, and co-authored Black America series, Portsmouth, Hampton Roads, Remembering Our Schools, and co-edited Voices from Within the Veil, African Americans and the Experience of Democracy. She has appeared on a number of national programs and documentaries, including PBS's Many Rivers to Cross, the History Channel's Race, Slavery, and the Civil War, and C-SPAN's broadcast on history. And so we welcome both Dr. Beavis and Dr. Cassandra Alexander. And I am wanting to make sure that you guys are being seen properly. Okay, so forgive me. Okay, so we wanted to start off, if you can put us into context, Dr. Cassandra Newby, what is really the history and who was Henrietta Lacks?
So the history of Henrietta Lacks is really a history or a story about how so many African Americans were treated, especially African American women. They were treated very poorly. They were basically seen as property, much like a cow or horse. They were chattel in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of so many people who owned them under slavery. And unfortunately, this translated into how they would be treated by medical science. Because, of course, they're human beings, so their anatomy was the same as white women. These Black women typically were experimented on. And so parts of their bodies were taken from them. Babies were taken out of their wombs. They were operated on without anesthesia many times. There were experiments on how to do a proper C-section. In fact, a lot of effort has gone into understanding this at Virginia Commonwealth University because of the experimentations that happened for decades at the Medical College of Virginia. And so Henrietta Lacks was part of this long history of looking at Black bodies as animals and treating them as such and taking what really was not theirs to take, but they took it and used it to help and enrich their lives and themselves. And Henrietta Lacks is perhaps the most extreme example of how an African-American woman who came in because she was having some gynecological problems, and she was getting what she thought was treatment, but they took her cells and they began to see certain things that they didn't see with other people. And they used those cells, reproduced them in the same way that scientists are using rats, scientists are using monkeys and other kinds of animals, and they didn't see anything wrong with it. So that's the basic context of Henrietta Lacks. And in the broader context, what they did to her was part of what they did to so many, especially African-American women, but African-Americans in general.
Thank you. Dr. Beavis, do you have anything that, how you want to, if you have your phone, can you please put yourself on mute? We'd really appreciate it. Thank you. Dr. Beavis, would you like to add in terms of how you came to know about Henrietta Lacks, and especially as you were coming into Hopkins and in a bit of your background, bringing you even into the U.S.?
Yeah, thank you. First, thank you for having me in that welcome introduction. So I was born in England, and then I moved to America when I was 11. And I think for me, the biggest thing that's had is this like national health system existed in England. It doesn't exist here. And so while there are certainly disparities, in England, you don't see as much effect of the social caste system that we have here that is, you know, now covert. But you don't see as much of that effect because there's a national health like safety net kind of system. And so that's what interests, like why I've been passionate about this kind of thing, right? Justice, and seeking justice for everyone, particularly respect for bodies, particularly Black bodies when we're talking about Baltimore. I think it's a really, really important and only very, very recently even recognized thing that we need to be focusing on. But I actually first heard about Henrietta Lacks from the book. Someone handed me the book. I can't remember if it was in residency or medical school. And I think the book is phenomenal. Like, I think it took me 2 days. I couldn't put it down, and it was so interesting. And I think when I reflect on this, I did some Googling. I was curious to see what my employer, Johns Hopkins, has about their kind of statement on this, and I hadn't really looked to them. So why would you look to Johns Hopkins for a source on Henrietta Lacks, right? And I noticed that, you know, the website mentioned several times that, you know, this was common practice. This was what was done for all socioeconomic classes and races, and this kind of almost justification. They don't quite get to justification, but I think one of the things that's like so important that we not do is not justify this, and recognize that it was wrong, and that while maybe they did take biopsies from people of different races, and maybe they did then take those tissue and culture them in the same way that they did with Henrietta Lacks, there's no question that during this time and previously, and, you know, still to this day, patients who have less agency, fewer resources, are less able to advocate for themselves and are easier to take advantage of. And I think that's, as a medical professional, we have a really hard time because we, you know, want to do no harm and do good and all of that. And it's hard for us to get past biases we may have and admit that, you know, this was, while this was commonly performed, it doesn't excuse it. And there's no question that Henrietta's race and her socioeconomic status affected how easily this was done without her knowledge. I don't even know if that answered your question, but that's my thoughts when I think about this.
I do know that it just gave us perspective on, you know, your passion and why you came. And that is what we really wanted to know in the beginning. So now when we're going into the HeLa cells and the legacy, can you explain to us exactly, I know that there are people who saw the movie, people who have read the book, but there are also people who are very unfamiliar with exactly what happened at Hopkins. Can you explain that to us?
Yes, I will explain it as best I can. I think and I actually learned a lot from the book, even though, you know, I did a biology degree as my undergrad degree. I've then done medical school, but nobody really teaches you about cell lines and what a cell line means. And I think the book did a really nice job of that. So essentially, you know, when we're trying to figure out, let's say we have cancer cells and we want to see, oh, does this chemotherapy work? Usually you would start not in humans, right? So you have a new drug or experimental treatment. You might start by giving a mouse cancer cells, and those cells would grow in the mouse, and then you would give treatment and you would see what the response was. Those cells have to come from somewhere. And even before then, you could grow cells and say you have cells in a petri dish and you could sprinkle some chemo on them. And if that worked, then you say, oh, okay, great. Maybe I'll put these cancer cells now in a mouse, and if it works in them, then maybe we'll move to humans. And so drug development for cancer really starts in the petri dish, but you can't have cells that die. They have to keep reproducing in order to have anything that you can actually treat, because if the cells do not continue to reproduce, then you don't know if they died because they were going to die or they died because you gave them an effective cancer treatment. And so up until the HeLa cells, there really weren't cells that you could keep alive. Dr. Gay, who was on the other page, I took a lot of different people's cells and had really struggled to keep them alive. I've never worked in a lab that does cell lines, but I have had friends who have, and keeping cells alive seems to be much harder than many experimental things. And so the HeLa cells were like, they basically allowed scientists to have cells on which to experiment with different drugs. So you could give the cells, different viruses and then different medications, et cetera, that until this point, you would have had to kind of use an animal, like a mouse or a rat or whatever. Again, this is not research that I do. It makes me very uncomfortable when mice are treated. But that's the reality of developing drugs, is they have to be tested in some way. So the HeLa cells were like, I mean, if they hadn't have happened, I don't know, someone's probably estimated this, but we would probably be if these cells had not been used, we'd probably be decades behind on lots of our drug development. But at the same time, obviously, we are now reconciling with we have an end, but does it justify the means?
Thank you. Dr. Newby, while we're here for Henrietta Lacks, you said that, I believe, can you expound upon that this was not the first time that Black bodies had been used in this way? Can you give us a little bit more of an understanding of what of the history of this type of experimentation and of Black bodies?
Sure, I'd like to. I know that there's some people who have their microphones not muted, and that there's a lot of feedback. It sounds like there's a ticking going on, so it would be great if people could just mute themselves. If you could go to the next slide, before I kind of go into some background, part of the justification that I would say medical science has engaged in for at least a century and a half is the outcome. So what have we produced? What has benefited society? So the outcome, outweighs how you got there. The ends justify the means, so to speak. And so, using these HeLa cells, they've been able to find treatments for all these diseases or conditions that are listed. Of course, there's no cure for Parkinson's disease, but some medicines have been developed to help ameliorate some of the conditions, especially in the early stages. You have polio vaccine that's been improved, forms of chemotherapy and gene mapping and in vitro fertilization. In fact, in Norfolk, you have the Jones Institute that pioneered that using these cells. Go to the next slide, if you would. But what has really been the legacy has been I call it post-traumatic stress disorder. There is a very deep-seated concern and mistrust among so many African Americans about that, and especially in places where those particular hospitals and medical schools have invaded the Black community and really abused them. In Richmond, for example, you have a number of people who were told when they were children, they're much older now, but they were told as children, don't be out at night. The folks at that hospital or at that medical school are going to kill you, and your body is going to end up as a cadaver on their tables. Or they're going to get you and experiment on you. And so when you return, you're not going to be the same as when you left. So very real deep-seated fears. And that was true also in Baltimore, even though you had an African-American hospital there, but they were small, and you had all these other hospitals and medical schools that were, white centric. that were busy experimenting on Black people. A lot of people forget that, Baltimore is in Maryland and Maryland is in the South. And as such, you had slavery and you had real deep-seated segregation practices and discrimination. And the place where so many people were discriminated against was in the hospital, but you didn't have the defenses to protect yourself because you didn't know what was going on with your body. You trusted the doctors, and many times they were simply experimenting on you. And so, Henrietta Lacks, so in her story, reminded me so much of some of the stories that people have pulled about the bottom of the well when they discovered these bodies at the bottom of the well that was right next to the medical school in Richmond, and how those bodies have been experimented on. And Richmond had this, I should say the medical college would have people go out and raid Black cemeteries for newly buried bodies so that they could use them as cadavers. So you didn't even have safety in death, that your body had the potential to be desecrated by that medical school and by the hospital. And they were using that once again, just as Blacks were used to enrich white society in America through slavery and through discrimination. They also used them to enrich society through medical experimentation to find out what worked, what didn't work, and discarded, just thrown into their remains. If you can imagine, their remains of human beings were thrown into a well and simply discarded. The next slide. So, I said all of that to get to this main point, and this is an award-winning book. If you haven't read it, please get a copy. Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington. And yes, she's been challenged by people who hate the fact that she's brought up all of this information. And historically, we've had I put air quotes around this, scientists / doctors. My favorite whipping boy is Dr. Samuel Cartwright, who believed that Black people were closer to dogs, the canine species, than they were humans, and actually wrote that in his book. And he also believed that Blacks could not feel pain the way that white people felt pain, that separating a mother from her child was like separating a dog from her puppies. And he believed that the only thing you could do that was really harmful to Blacks is not regiment them. So if you didn't regiment them, they would get diseases like drapetomia, the disease of running away. And so they came up with all these wild fantasies. And so Harriet Washington takes this, and she, as an ethicist, she looks at this long history of abuse after abuse after abuse. And she talks about this man named James Sims, who was the father of gynecology. And I know Anna will talk a little bit more about him as well. But he was worse than the Nazis experimenting on the Jews in the concentration camps, because he performed gynecological surgeries on African-American women who were enslaved without anesthesia. And he made claims that, they didn't feel pain the way that whites felt it. Or he gave the other excuse, I didn't know they were in pain. Well, I don't know how you can cut somebody and they're screaming and not know that they're in pain. So he was a horrible, horrible individual. And, Dr. Washington also talks about this woman who was abused by her owner and later purchased by P.T. Barnum and made a sideshow hustle for him, where he made thousands of dollars, claiming that she was over 160 years old. pulling out her teeth so that it appeared that she was much older than she was, and claiming that she was the nursemaid of George Washington. And this was in the 1830s. She died, I believe, in 1836. And when she died, there were some who challenged P.T. Barnum, and they simply they said, well, we're going to perform an autopsy on her in public. And there were 1,500 people who purchased tickets to see this woman's body disgraced in public, just to prove that she was not over 160 years old. And so Washington goes into great painstaking details, talking about that, talking about the experimentations that have happened even currently in a lot of African countries throughout the many generations, with some of the most recent ones in the 1990s with HIV and AIDS, as well as meningitis testing, and not telling people that they were taking placebos, but instead, giving them this idea that they were being helped and healed in the same way down in Tuskegee during the Tuskegee experiment, where people were infected with syphilis and told that they were getting treatment when they really were not.
Wow. When we go and we're looking at medicine, Dr. Beavis, isn't there a Hippocratic oath that's talking about doing no harm? How does that kind of coincide, or in the ethics of that, coincide with what has happened, or at least let's put us back into in the early 20th century? We know what's going on now, but at least what happened then? Yes.
I think the Hippocratic Oath, I mean, my experience, we did not say the entire Hippocratic Oath. However, the kind of key things that come out are, first, do no harm, and other ethical principles like that I think of when I think of kind of the practice of medicine. The 4 ethical things are basically to do good, which is opposite from do no harm. And then autonomy, so patients having powers over their own bodies, and then justice. And I think of justice as like equal or equitable care for people. And so I think, obviously, especially with Dr. Sims, who I can tell you there is still a Sims speculum that is still called the Sims speculum. And I knew of the speculum before I knew of the history. And have since, we don't use in our practice, we don't use that name as the name of the speculum if we use the instrument. The instrument is a useful instrument, but it does not deserve or need to have the name of that person affiliated with it. But anyway, I think about the ethical principles that really get but with this story, Henrietta Lacks, but also with Dr. Sims. And I think the biggest ones, obviously, is first do no harm and do good. And those, I think, are less, they're a little bit more concrete than the ones that are justice. Or I guess I would say they're less influenced by societal norms than justice, which is, equitable care. So if a woman gets anesthesia for her surgery because she is white, a Black woman should also get anesthesia for her surgery. That would be justice. And that is something that can be so heavily influenced by societal norms and beliefs. And so medicine, I think we often think of ourselves as, in this separate place where we have ethical principles, but the reality is we are part of society. And at this time, with Dr. Sims, it was not considered unethical at all to do any kind of surgical experimentation on a Black person without anesthesia. That just wasn't considered unethical. And so I think that medicine is not immune from society. And then autonomy is the other big one. And I think this is where Henrietta Lacks, her story is really important. So autonomy means power over your own body. You get to say no. You know, I actually am always, it is always upsetting to me to the number of women who I know who don't know that in the middle of a pelvic exam, you can say no, you can say stop, right? You have power over your own body. But there's a dynamic in medicine where the doctor is considered hierarchically above the patient. Like there's this very paternalistic relationship. And so I think autonomy and justice are two ethical principles that are so heavily influenced by the society at large, that is why, despite said Hippocratic oath, you could still have all of this going on. And literally other doctors wrote letters in defense of Dr. Sims because they couldn't see past their societal norm lens.
And, you know, Anna, I'd like to put it another way. They couldn't see past their racism. All they could see is that this is this is someone I'm going to use because it's going to benefit me and mine. And unfortunately, and you're right, society still today cannot see past these stereotypes that are so negatively targeting African Americans. The number of African American women, for example, who come into the hospital or go to their doctor and are not given pain medicines because there is this societal belief that Black people are more likely to be drug addicts. And so they're coming in there, to feed their drug addictions, when of course the complete opposite is true. And what kind of damage does this ongoing pain do to the body over years and years and years? I personally suffer from endometriosis from the time I started my menses until the final solution when I was 40. And I kept having people tell me, oh, well, it's not, the pain is, is like, they would give me a Midol. It's like, what is a Midol? That's like a Tic Tac. That's not going to help endometriosis. And yet, all these doctors that I went to knew I had this particular ailment, but no one ever bothered telling me. They said other things, but they did not tell me what they knew. And this is not in terms of the doctor being Black or white. I've had Black and white physicians. None of them told me this because there is this perception that society puts in everyone's mind. That's what racism is. It doesn't require conscious thought. It's just how you behave and act. And so even today, I know that the family has reconciled to some degree with the continued use of their mother's cells because of the focus on, oh, look at all the great and good that it has done. But I guess I'm of the opinion that they do not have the right to continue to use her cells because too many people have simply seen her cells disembodied from the human being from which they were taken. And as long as that disembodiment is there, even with the book, there's still people who do not see the cells as part of a human being that once was alive. And I find that to be problematic.
I agree. And that is the reason why we even named this the humanizing of the HeLa cells. With all of that history, how do we reconcile all of the quote unquote achievements that have happened because of the HeLa cells, and really how has it impacted how medicine, especially at Hopkins right now, is kind of not only taught or practiced. Are there any specific changes challenges that have happened since her story has really come to the forefront, because it hasn't been long since the story has been told. And there's still not a lot of people who are very familiar with the story.
I
Dr. B?
will, yes, it sounded like a me question. I did want to reflect on something that Dr. Nubi Alexander said, which is that, I mean, I think it's important to know there are studies that show that Black patients receive less pain medication for the same type of pain. But even when you simulate that, like literally studies where you give a case vignette, a story to a student doctor, medical student, or a doctor, and say, here's the case, and then you just change the race, it changes the answer. And I think that, to me, that's not the real world setting, because it's asking them how they would practice, but that to me is even more like powerful, because that person knows they're being tested on like how they're going to react. It's not the real world where they should be more conscious. And I think that the fact that obviously there's so much about racism that is largely unconscious, but being or trying to be, as I hope to try and live my life in an anti-racist way, takes conscious effort all the time, and it should, and we should commit to that. And I think that, to answer your question, Vanessa, is something that more and more, I can really only speak to the Department of GYN OB, and we don't call it OB-GYN, it's called GYN OB. It's like, you know, I don't know, an old white guy a real long time ago said it had to be GYN OB, otherwise it's a whole thing. So that's why I say it backwards. But we have started to essentially in 2020, very similar to, I think, many institutions with George Floyd and the pandemic, many people, as I like to say, many people started taking a knee. And one of the things that we have tried to do is not just be performative, but actually consciously think about all of the different ways in medical. There's medical education, then there's medical care of patients. So there's many different facets we have to think about, research as well, and really think about those from a race conscious lens, and trying to increase our diversity of our students, of our faculty, increasing our relationships with the community, and improving those relationships. But I think we are not doing enough, and we're doing it very late, right? To put it frankly, and for anyone who, most of you don't know me, I'm pretty blunt. I think it became sexy, so we started doing it, you know, it became trendy. And I think the good thing is we got there and things are changing. And I think when I got here and I did my MPH, the Bloomberg School of Public Health does a really good job of being very critical of how Hopkins has been a behemoth in the society and the community, and really, you know, this powerhouse that can wield its power in different ways. And so I felt like I got a really good education on that before I started. And so I think that reconciling with that more is something that is becoming something that our institution is willing to do and willing to recognize as important. I think, unfortunately, there's billions of cells and they're everywhere. I don't like feasibly, we couldn't take them back from, I mean, it's probably every single institution that has a cell line has a HeLa cell, because they're just that pervasive. I can't remember the line in the book where she kind of, it feels like even they like in the air, they found them like floating in the air. It's like wild. But I think that's part of reconciling, right? It's not just Henrietta Lacks and her family. It's like the entire history of racism against Black people in America. Like there needs to be huge changes as basically like I'm not expressing myself particularly well, except to say like it shouldn't be just like one thing. Let's say we're gonna give some money to the Lacks family. No, like this was a systemic problem that caused this. Like our answer to this should be a big systemic change. And I know that Johns Hopkins has every year they have like a Henrietta Lacks lecture, and remembrance. I think that started relatively recently, because it didn't, when I first got there in 2016, it wasn't going on, but you know, we can do more. They're naming a building after her. It's nice. Doesn't change much. So I as I said, I'm like all of these opinions are mine and not Johns Hopkins. So I'm sure they wouldn't love exactly what I'm saying, but I think that's as a white gynecologist at Johns Hopkins, I really think we need to do more, and we need to do more consciously. And I think all of the things that led to these cells being taken and without their knowledge being used, all of that are things that we have to reconcile with and improve. And to me, that's how you could even start to begin to reconcile with this legacy that has been. But we could do more.
We could do more. We do know that one of the things that has come, or the evolution of this story, is that we have new laws. We have things called consent that are now very important. But I'm thinking back in the movie where her brother, Zachariah, was talking about, oh, I still engage with Hopkins because I go there to get money for research. Can you explain to me the difference in what has happened with Henrietta Lacks, and for people who are now going to these institutions and getting paid for the research? Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yes, I think research is really tricky because of coercion. So there's multiple, I mean, every institution has research. I happen to know about I know some of the studies going on at Johns Hopkins, but you may also know about them if you ever say Johns Hopkins near your phone and it starts advertising things to you. You can be given dengue, the virus. I think it's a virus, not a bacteria. You can be given Zika, and you can get paid thousands of dollars to see what happens to your body. And that is something that, like, you can't, someone who has a well-paying job and doesn't need an additional $1,000 to keep the lights on in their house or feed their children, they're not going to go for that study. But the unemployed person who doesn't have those resources, which in Baltimore and most of the US is much more likely Black or other people of color, they would be more likely to do that. And so even when in research you have to informed consent, the idea is that you inform the patients of the risks and benefits, they decide if the balance is sufficient, and they decide to do the study or decide to have the surgery. For example, endometriosis, at some point, the benefit of a hysterectomy outweighs the risks because of pain, etc. With research, that's a bit trickier because sometimes the benefit is financial. And we have institutional review boards, which are designed to, they have many different members, so as doctors, researchers, etc., but always also community members. And one of their jobs is to make sure that research isn't coercive. But if you didn't pay someone to give them Zika, why would anyone do that study, right? So there's really tricky balance for research and ensuring the patient truly has informed consent, that there's no coercion. And honestly, informed consent is really hard because there's a huge amount of medicine that, if you haven't studied medicine, is hard to explain. I think it's optimistic to think that a patient could truly understand all of the possible risks and their balance with the benefits. So as a person who does research, I mostly do research that involves implementing programs to help people. So it usually, you don't have to worry about coercion. But I do think it's something we have to, as a research community, think very carefully about. And coercion is something that would be the next kind of the modern way to take advantage of people who are underserved or disenfranchised.
Thank you. Dr. Newby. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think that Anna did a fabulous job in really covering all the ends of it. You know, when you're talking about ethics, it is always colored in our society with racism because ethics doesn't apply to everybody. And there's always a workaround. And so paying people to participate in these studies is the workaround. And who are the people that you typically get? Well, you know, if you're in college, they're always trying to get college students who need money. And those who need money are usually those whose families do not have a wealth of resources. And so you're preying on the same kinds of people, those who are struggling financially. So you have a lot of first generation white students who get caught up in that, just like a lot of first generation Black students, Hispanics, and so forth. And so you're still preying on the vulnerability of people who the decision to participate, but they don't necessarily have the choices that others would have, as Anna said, not to participate because their needs are so great. And so, you know, that whole idea of still being unethical, but hiding under this veneer of being ethical is still a really big problem in medical science, because I always say, who's in the room making these decisions? You know, who are the ones talking about it? And if you don't really look at who's in the room, you know, I was in a meeting not too long ago. I'm sitting in downtown Norfolk that is almost 50% Black, and you could count on 3 fingers the number of Black people who were in this huge room of about 100 people, all getting ready to make some big decisions. And so the decision makers are not reflective of the community, and they're all the usual suspects of who the decision makers are. And so medical science, and especially the American Medical Association, they have a lot to apologize for. You're talking about an organization that backed Sims. He was, I think, president of the organization. Oh my God, you've got this Hitler-like character, you know, in charge of your organization with decades of horribly abusing people. I mean, you know, at Virginia Commonwealth, I'm sorry, at MCV, the Medical College of Virginia, they actually would amputate legs of enslaved men who were older, who were too old to work, without anesthesia, to perfect amputation without killing the patient. So how many people did they kill before they came up with the best practices for that? So, you know, there's so much to go back to, and you know, you're going to have to remove those individuals who have been making these decisions for these personal and I would say racially motivated reasons. You can't get them to make the decision. And these kinds of ones and dones, you know, we're going to put up a monument. We're going to rename the building. Well, that doesn't change anything really, because the same kinds of people are making the same kinds of decisions because they come from that same world, that same, what my niece likes to say, that same snow globe. You know, they're all kind of circulating in that rarefied environment, and they don't really care about other people. And then when medical science really moved from, you know, many hospitals being owned by cities or counties into corporate hospitals where the goal is to make money, you have even more damage being done. Like when Bon Secours they became a partner with the owners of Richmond Community Hospital. They moved the hospital into a poor neighborhood away from the middle-class Black neighborhood. And they've been basically using that hospital to make a lot of money for bon secours and then sending that money to the hospitals in the suburbs where white people dominate instead of putting that money back into that hospital. So those kinds of practices, and I'm not talking about 10, 15 years ago, I'm talking about right now. That's what's going on. And a lot of that was being revealed, and they're continuing to do that. So we you really can't change things as long as the same people are in that room making decisions for pretty much the same reasons.
Thank you. I am going to I'm going to stop sharing the screen and open it up, because I do know that there will be people who have questions. And so I know that I've had someone checking the actual chat while we were speaking. But does anyone have a question? Please, at this point, or first of all, Dr. Beavis, did you want to respond?
Yeah, there were two questions in the chat about DNA, which I think are pretty, it's a great thing to talk about and clarify with regards to Henrietta Lacks. So the first one talks about the big data, molecular DNA data, and application for future research. So this is somewhat tricky, but let's just from a clinical perspective. So if a patient comes in and they have cancer, there's testing that you can do of the DNA of the cancer itself. So not of the person, but of the cancer. Now the cancer being a part of the person, right? That's why the HeLa cells are part of Henrietta Lacks. But to clarify that the DNA abnormalities in the tumor are not present in the rest of the human body. Otherwise, everything would be cancer. So anyway, you can do testing to see what genes are abnormal and in what way. And that's helpful because things like immunotherapy that I'm sure you guys, Keytruda, like can't stop advertising. I'm sure you've seen some of the ads for that, and other things that are targeted therapies, immunotherapies, other new drugs that are specifically targeted to a genetic mutation that the tumor has. Those are things that you have to have that testing done to know. And that testing doesn't give all of your DNA sequences in your body. It's not your genome, which would be all of your DNA in your body kind of sequenced and kind of an understanding of what is your exact unique DNA. That's not what those tests do. But they do require, when you have surgery, a piece of cancer is taken, and typically some is retained for future use, mostly for things like this, where for the patient, it would be helpful to send it off for testing. So in my line of work, when a patient's cancer recurs, often that's time that we need to assess for options other than the standard first line options. And so if possible, I would do another biopsy and send that biopsy off for testing. If not, I use the original surgical specimen. Now, when someone has surgery at Johns Hopkins, there is an entire paragraph dedicated to, I'm okay with everything that you're taking from me being used for research. And you are allowed to say no to that. And I think this is where sometimes it feels like you can't say no, but yes, you can. You can say, no, I do not allow that. And that actually comes up to what Rochelle had said, which is that many people don't know that they can revoke the permission of the pathology department to use it for anything other than clinical care. So other than the test that you need to do for your patient or for yourself or your family member, you can revoke that specimen from being used for anything else. So that DNA data can't be used for anything else. That piece of tissue can't be used for anything else. But you do have to ask, and quite honestly, it's, I think, happened once in my career. But if it were to happen, I would figure out who I would need to facilitate, like legal or whomever. But like everyone should feel that they have the right to ask for their tissue specimens, their DNA data, etc., not to be used for research. It's part of the reason that there are community members on the IRB, that review board that looks at every research study. But I'm participating in a study by Kemi Doll that's actually social support for Black women with endometrial cancer. And one of our patients, it's just asking about social isolation and stress and things like that, and then providing social support. And she it said, we would use your data for up to a year and then we would destroy the data. And the Johns Hopkins consent form, that was what University of Washington, which is where the study started, said. And ours said, we can use your data forever. And she was like, I really don't like that line. So we drafted up a contract letter that says we confirm that we will destroy all of your data after a year, after it's been analyzed. And I think what's sometimes not clear on consent forms is like you could sign a consent form and then if a minute later you turned around and said no, your no trumps the consent. That you can always say no and you can always ask back and question. And I think I expect that many of my patients are not going to feel empowered to do that. There's a hierarchy in medicine where, like I kind of talked about earlier, I can't remember if it was pre everyone being on or not, but this paternalism where there's this hierarchy and you don't want to piss the doctor off, right? But you should, and you need to advocate for yourself. And if you're having pain and the doctor ignores it, you got to go back to another doctor, you got to get to that doctor. I think that we, as a medical professional, need to do better, but we need to be held to that higher standard. So if you wanted none of the DNA information to be used for research, that is something that could be arranged. And then I didn't speak to DNA of your whole body, which would be like what we call germline, just means all of your cells have that same DNA sequence. And that's like if we do a testing to see if someone has, say, a BRCA gene mutation, which is a cancer gene mutation associated with breast and ovary cancer. Those results, again, don't give you all of your DNA ever. They just test for specific gene mutations. And then if you do have them, the report says that you have them, but that wouldn't be, it's not like there's a record anywhere of all of your gene mutations, although honestly, probably in like 10 or 15 years, that could be possible. But I think for me, from these questions, I think it's more the fact that if a biopsy is performed, then the hospital typically has permission to use that for research, unless you explicitly say you don't want it to be used for research. So that would be a thing to advocate for if you felt that way, which would be a perfectly reasonable thing to feel. And that's called autonomy. It's your body and your choice. I'm just looking at the other.
Here, there's another question that came on. Let me see. Dr. Beavis, do you feel that the application of using AI in research will enhance and shorten research studies, especially in the area of cellular research for many GYN diseases and cancers?
That's a great question. AI is like, I think we're about to see a revolution. It's really impressive how much it can do. Even you can have like an AI program read a medical chart and begin to predict what the diagnosis is. Like probably AI will diagnose endometriosis better than we do, because we're really bad at diagnosing that for some reason. I don't know exactly how it will, but I do think that AI has the potential to help expedite and catalyze a lot of the research that we do. Definitely.
But isn't it still dependent upon inputs, right? And so can
Yes.
some of those inputs also, be biased? And how are we going to ensure equity or we really want to get to justice? Even with the AI, can it make the problem even worse?
Yes, everything. It's as they say in some of the studies that we do, when we combine studies, for example, we say garbage in, garbage out. So bias data in, bias data out. No question. I think that is something that has to be reconciled. I mean, it's like the facial recognition software, right? You fed it a bunch of white people's faces. No wonder it doesn't recognize different facial structures as human faces. I mean, that, I don't know if you are aware of that terrible situation. But I think that's a great example of like, and actually, so when Cami Doll was here yesterday, that was one of the things she was talking about, is if we don't question everything around us, then we just see what we're told to see. So I kind of think of it like the AI is the same way. If we feed it biased information comes out. So it's a great point that it needs to be purposely and consciously inclusive of diverse people and diseases, and really, really, I think being very purposeful and what is the word? I think it's just purposeful. You have to be conscious that you could, AI has the potential for harm too. There's no question. So I think we have to be very, very aware of that.
You know, it still goes back to the whole idea of who's in the room designing these things. Because, you know, cultural biases are so subtle. And there are just so many justifications that are provided that unless you are in the room, unless you have different voices in that room, not just one, because I tell people, I, as an African-American woman, cannot integrate a room. I'm a single individual. You know, integration, it means that you've got to have more than 1, 2, or 3 people in that room. And so it's the same way for AI technology. That's why, you know, hopefully these agencies have set that aside for facial recognition. But we know with all the George Floyd protests that a lot of the police departments have manuals that actually teach police officers how to behave based on what the race of the person they're trying to arrest, or the race of the person that they're approaching. And that's a problem, because all of these case studies provide examples of being more violent, more ready to shoot, more ready to expect violence. And so, you know, it really is a big problem when you're talking about projecting, you know, with all these algorithms. What has gone into the algorithm? So if that algorithm says you are African American, what are they saying together with that? Oh, are you more likely to be a drug addict? Are you more, you know, likely not to take care of yourself? Are you more likely to be obese? And so it goes back to what Sims did, which was he liked to blame the victim for their own victimization. While he was victimizing them, he was blaming them, saying, well, you know, they didn't take care of themselves properly, rather than trying to really get at the primary problem.
Okay. I see, there are you reading the questions, Dr. Vivas? Was that where you're going?
Yes, multiple. I'm going.
Yes, they're coming in. Thank you.
I actually thought so. I think just reflecting on what Dr. Nubia Alexander just said, this idea they're not taking care of themselves. And one of the things that I think the language that we use in medicine, which is also finally increasingly being like recognized. I mean, patients are non-compliant, right? A non-compliant patient is labeled and then is it's automatically a negative bias against said patient. But maybe that patient was non-compliant because like they missed the bus or the bus didn't come and so they couldn't get here. That's why they were late, or they couldn't get their medicines because they can't afford them. And I think that's just one of the many ways in which the language that we use is really important for making sure that we don't perpetuate biases. One of the things that I was surprised, you know, I live in a bit of a bubble, a medicine bubble. And so there was some papers recently that came out that I knew about, but some of my friends who are not in medicine were surprised by. And these were papers challenging the idea that there's such a thing as a VIP patient. And that's the idea that someone comes in and their care is worth, like their life is worth more than the person next to them. And my entire medical career, I have been told that there are VIP patients. And I recently decided if anyone's going to use the term, they have to be able to tell me that someone is less worthy. They have to be able to tell someone is like less important. Otherwise, we can't use that term and it shouldn't be used. But all of that to say the words that we use are so important and reinforcing of biases. So that was my reflection there. And then there are I love so much in the chat. One of the questions about oncologist care in rural settings, which I think is really interesting. So a patient diagnosed in a rural setting will likely do worse than someone in an urban setting with cancer because of lack of access to the, to treatments to a subspecialist, right? Like if, I'm a GYN oncologist, I give chemo for GYN cancers only. I don't give them for other cancers. If you're out in the middle of nowhere, wherever, middle of America, let's say, you might be getting your chemo from someone who gives, they're the only oncologist in the county, and they give for all different types of cancer. And so they might not know the most recent advances in chemotherapy and treatment. And even about a year ago, I had a patient who was a Black woman with endometrial cancer, and there had been a change to the practice guidelines more than a year ago that introduced a third chemotherapy agent to the, usually we do 2, but if you add the third, it improved survival. And she was getting care at a more rural location, had come for a second opinion. And when I called her provider, they refused to give the third agent because they were unaware of the most recent data, even though it had been in the guidelines for over a year. And I think in medicine, we have continuing medical education where you have to do modules and things, but it is a major problem. And with Google, obviously as a physician, I don't love when someone comes in with like a massive stack of Google data, but at the same time, it's how you can advocate for yourself, right? It's how you can at least, if you go to the good, like Mayo Clinic has great stuff, Hopkins has stuff, MSKCC, there's good websites. There's some websites like that aren't as good. I can't remember the names of them right now, but anyway, I do think the internet, it's a double-edged sword, but it is a place where if you're somewhere more remote, you can at least do some level of investigation for what are the standards. The National Comprehensive Cancer Network, NCCN, is actually their guidelines. Like you have to sign up to log into their guidelines, but it's free for everyone. So if you ever wanted to see what the guidelines are for any cancer, you can. And they have a really good website, just nccn.org. But optimizing care in the rural setting, the hardest thing is that if you live closer to a comprehensive cancer center, you're more likely to do better with your cancer care and live longer. But it is not reasonable to think that everyone could move. And so there has been some, for decades, trying to figure out how can we bring providers there? How do you maximize that? And I think one of the ways we need to do it is to improve the flow of data sharing. So when there are big practice changes, making sure those things get out. And that's one thing, we try to do. I feel very, very lucky to work at Johns Hopkins because I feel like I'm up to date to the minute. I get held to a very high standard. And we do try to engage with other more remote kind of places. Allegheny Health, for example, we partner with them and that helps build up. They can come to our tumor board, which is where we discuss our complex cases, and that helps with the transfer of knowledge.
Question. We were talking about rural access. As you know, Project Nana is really targeting our seasoned women, and we know that access is very difficult with policies from Medicare and the reimbursement rates, and thus the willingness of gynecologists to even see them on a basis. And add to that maybe some hesitancy that they have or misinformation about continuing to go to the gynecologists themselves. Do you find that when you're looking, when someone comes into your practice that has cancer, what are the rates that we have are more seasoned women? And can you just speak to their staging when they come in? What do they tend to look like? What does that typical person tend to look like? And is it something that we can do to improve their care in their access of care?
Great question. to respond to one small thing, Rochelle at some point, I think, said she was loud voice in the room, and I love it. Chat GHP, we are not using, or I'm not using. I kind of had to look it up, but I understand that it's something automated that I'm not using. It's something AIE that I am not yet going to adopt, because I question those things. I know someone who wrote a cover letter with it though, and they said it did very well. So, and then someone said there was a VIP wing in the hospital. That's very common, and it's completely unacceptable in my world. I mostly trained in county hospitals. So when I came to Johns Hopkins, I had a lot of trepidation about working somewhere where I knew that there would be patients of different socioeconomic classes. And my concern was there would be that. There is a ward that was previously the quote VIP wing, as I'm very lucky in my GYN world. We get the same wonderful, very GYN specific care in our ward, and we don't interact with that. And I don't know exactly how much it is still touted as a VIP. So to answer your question about stage, I can't tell you how heartbreaking it is that so many of our patients come in with symptoms that have been going on for months to years. I had a patient, she had undergone a hysterectomy with me. She had come in for a ovary mass, and she was in her late 50s and had not had periods for years, and now was having literally 10 pads a day hemorrhaging. And I was consulted by general surgery for the mass. Nobody had asked her about her periods. Like, no, I mean, and those are not normal. You shouldn't have a period once you've gone through menopause. That's an abnormal bleeding. And she had pre-cancer, and she came into my office post hysterectomy, and her sister came with her, and her sister was like, well, I kind of bleed like that for like the last 4 years. And so I sent her, I was like, go ahead and check in. I sent her to the desk and had her check in, had her come back, did a biopsy, and long story short, she had the first patient had pre-cancer, her sister had cancer, but it was this norm. They were sisters, they lived together, and like they both bled, and so they both thought it was normal, and they didn't know like when to go in. And honestly, they wouldn't have had this patient, the original first sister, had she not had a big mass in her ovary, which was nothing, it was completely benign. Had she not had that, they never, would have been ages till they presented. And the lack of recognition that any bleeding after menopause is abnormal really holds a lot of women back from seeking care. And then especially for Black women, unfortunately, the more aggressive, faster moving cancers are more common in Black women. And so even a shorter delay in a more aggressive cancer is more dangerous and results in a later stage than a longer delay in a less aggressive cancer. And I think there's getting the word out about like any bleeding. There was a campaign that Kemi Dole told us about yesterday. It was like, oh, red dab, red flag. If you see a dab of red on the pad after menopause, red flag, go to the doctor. And then we have to overcome you need to be comfortable going to the doctor. The doctor needs to do the correct procedure, which lots of women get ultrasounds, and realistically a biopsy first is probably more important because Black women more often have fibroids, and fibroids distort the ultrasound, and then the ultrasound images aren't as helpful. So Kemi Dole, who I've mentioned a bunch, I'm basically like a fangirl for her because she's doing this amazing work. And one of the things she's doing is literally showing how the guidelines that we have for working up women for endometrial or uterine cancer are built on racist premises of exactly what you said, Vanessa. The data we put in to building those guidelines was a bunch of data from white women. And so it doesn't apply to Black women who have significantly more fibroids. We're talking like 60, 70% of women have fibroids by the age of menopause. Oh God, as usual, a really long answer to your question, but getting the word out about abnormal symptoms is like endometrial cancer specifically. Most, like very, very, almost all patients are going to have some bleeding. And so recognizing it's abnormal, feeling comfortable to go to the doctor, getting the right procedure, like that's how we make it so we pick people up at earlier stages, and that's how people are more likely to be cured.
Dr. Newby, did you wanted to add something?
I just wholeheartedly agree. And I think that I'm very concerned about these very conservative attacks on educating people about their bodies, all under the auspices of, supposed care for the patient when, here in Virginia some years ago, they wanted to force women to have certain types of tests if they wanted to have an abortion, very invasive procedures. And so, the women are really under attack quite a bit. But we don't always react the way we should. You know, I think there's a lack of confidence, lack of proactiveness. Anna talked about, this paternalism that's there. I think that in a lot of religious settings, people are kind of acclimated, socialized to be deferential, especially to men or anyone in authority, and so that counters our ability to really be vocal about what our needs are and tell people. There's a lot of fear as well. Going to the doctor, there's it's kind of like an ancestral memory. You grow up with this idea that going to the doctor can be, if you bring up an issue that you have, that can be a death sentence. So, I'm not going to talk about it at all. That way, there's no death sentence that I might get. And of course that's ridiculous, but you talk to people and you find out, yeah, that is a problem. The other thing is, doctors are taught kind of how to talk to patients, but they don't really talk to patients. They talk at patients. And there are exceptions, a lot of exceptions. But, I just a personal experience when I took my mother who has Parkinson's to the doctor, and the doctor's talking at her, not even to her, and she's using technical medical terms. And I looked at her and I said, so can you translate that into English, please? And she looked at me, kind of blinked, because I felt like I was talking to a robot. And I said, you have to remember, I have not been to medical school. I've been to graduate school, but not in medicine. And so you need to break that down a little bit and help us to understand what treatment pattern is there, what the problem is. And it took a lot of effort on her part to break that down. And I think for some people, they're so focused on staying what they call professional, which is remote from the patient, so that they don't get too close emotionally to whatever the patient is going through. And I understand the difficulties of, having to deal with people, especially if they're very ill. And if you get emotionally tied in, it can really send you into a tailspin. But for so many people, they need a human being to talk with them, not at them, but with them. And it takes a little bit more time, but as medicine is capitalized, you don't have that time. Everything is, you got to get in, get them out, get them in, get them out. And so if you're not the type of person who will talk about your problems, you'll never talk to the doctor until it's pretty much too late. And that is the struggle. And some of that really has to do with going back to my point about who's in the room making these decisions about how you should communicate with people, how you should interact with your patient, how much time you should spend with your patients, how do you approach the patient to really find out what's going on so that you educate them, because they've normalized what is actually abnormal because they don't know, and then there's fear on top of that. And if you're not educating the doctor from the moment they walk into medical school until they leave, as to really how to interact with people. I call it just the male approach, give me the facts and, the dragnet approach, just don't give me a whole bunch of explanation, just, and women don't talk like that. Men don't talk like that. In fact, if you really look at it, men talk to women so that women can talk for them, because they don't want to give you a whole lot of details. And a woman can help pull out those details that will then provide that information that's helpful to the physician. But if you have that, you've got so many minutes to get in and out, you're going to have a problem. I did want to kind of speak to that next question about the automatic faucets. And it's really just something that, as a faculty member, if you want information out and you want to create a lot of attention to a problem, get young people who do social media, who have a lot of followers, get them to champion that. And I'm telling you, they can bring an onslaught of real negative attention to a problem, and get the other media to pay attention to that particular problem. I know that a lot of our faculty in the art department have really been getting their students to help them to approach that very problem, because the automatic faucets are set to a certain skin tone. And if you're darker, it will not come on because you're darker.
Wow. And Dr. Beavis, I'm going to give you the last word, because we are here at almost that time.
I have 3 thoughts, if that's okay. So Odom in the chat had said, about speaking up and getting resentment and willingness to stop. And I think I can't speak to this myself. However, I do worry about it. I mean, if I tell you, just keep speaking up, keep questioning, etc. I mean, I don't have the color of my skin means that I do not come off as the angry Black woman, which is a stereotype that is, I think, could hurt your ability to communicate if like by me telling you to speak up for yourself. However, continue to speak up for yourself, because there are other doctors and it is harder when you're in a place where there's only a few. But I do think it's really important. Like, we have to listen. We have to hold ourselves to a higher standard and just keep questioning when things don't feel right. Vanessa, I think one thing I didn't mention, but that's like GYN care doesn't end with menopause. It continues. Yes. You should go to your doctor every year, your GYN. Nobody else is looking at your vulvar or your vagina, like a vulvar skin, your vagina. You can't see it unless you get a mirror and go, looking. And so to me, even though you're not having a period, let's say even if you've had a hysterectomy, I think it's still really important. And some of that is that if you do have a symptom, there's someone you're comfortable with that's been established. I have a patient this week. She hasn't seen a GYN in forever. She's been a primary care doctor like clockwork. Now she's got stage 4 cancer because that primary care doctor doesn't know how to do GYN care and didn't do it. And I think having that trusted relationship, if you can maintain that every year and don't let it drop off just because you've stopped having children and stopped having periods, that could help too. And actually, that was just 2 thoughts, but I think that was it.
Well, I thank you. First of all, I want to thank you guys, Dr. Newby and Dr. Beavis. Thank you so much for your insight, your generosity of time, and just for your authenticity, because we can feel your passion about really not only the subject matter about, but also just educating us and wanting us to understand how to have that sense of agency and autonomy over our own body. So thank you so very much. I want to say, and thank you, Dr. Beavis, that's what Project Nana is trying to do, is to make sure that women, particularly our seasoned women, have the knowledge and the skill set to be able to advocate for themselves and to push against that seemingly white coat. And if I had just had one policy we can change, they ask when you go to the doctor, primary care, when's the last time you had your period? How about just asking, when's the last time you bled? You know, because the period is like, or the onset of your period, right? But if you say bleeding, because people may not associate just that drop of blood as a period, but maybe that just little thing could help us, particularly Black women with the endometrial cancer issue. Then I also want to take this time just to say, give a plug for what is coming up. We have an organization that we work with that is doing an HeLa conference. It's a mental health, because as we know, dealing with Black women and our bodies and our health, it's not just about, you know, below the head. We have to do below the basement issues as well as above the head. So dealing with our full bodies, our full selves, our mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical selves. And so I wanted to just pass this on, that there will be an HeLa conference that will be coming up by Project Nana's own psychologist, which is Dr. Christy Norwood. And then just to say thank you and to continue to support Project Nana. Our next Nana Chat to bring to the table is My Body, My Choice, Destigmatizing Cosmetic Procedures for Seasoned Women. You know, when we talk about My Body, My Choice, everyone tends to think that we're talking about the reproductive season. But as we know that our seasoned women are living longer, and not only living longer, they're living fully and are healthier. And sometimes they also want to have, you know, to feel good about themselves in whatever way they choose. So we have a woman, plastic surgeon, who's going to come and talk about whatever the different procedures are. So please join us on the third Friday in March. And also, we solicit you guys to continue to help support what we're trying to do. Last year, we were able to send 5 women to the gynecologist, and we were able to get a woman back who had stage 1 cancer. Some of the women hadn't gone to the gynecologist in over 15 years, and they had been nurses because they were told that they didn't need to. This year, we're trying to do 50 women. So please help us, please join us. And we just really thank you for your continued support. Look out, because you will receive a survey so that we can ask how we were doing tonight, and what we can do for you and how we can serve you in the future. And remember, take Nana to the doctor. That really is our tagline, take Nana to the doctor. So I thank everyone. Thank you. God bless you. And I hope that you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Not able to put my
Good
message in
night.
the chat, but I wanted to say thank you.
Oh, thank you so very much.
Thank you. Excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you
all
for all the
having
new folks who came. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. It was the best.
It was really good.
Thank
Great
you.
information.
Thank
Beautiful.
you.
Yes, thank you all.
That is because of who we had on here.
Yes, I
would
enjoyed
agree.
every moment of it. Yes.
Absolutely. They were absolutely fantastic. I've learned a lot, and just
Yes.
I hope
Yes.
that this is not the last time you guys will engage with us. Push us, and come to us with other topics that you want to discuss. As you see, we have women that are eager. This
Yes.
whole idea of our seasoned women as end of life, I don't understand what that is. So we have women who are doing peer support advocate training to not only listen to what you guys are saying, but they're taking it with them and taking it out into the community. So we're very grateful for that.
Wonderful. Take care.
Thank you. Good night. Thank you so very much.
Okay,
Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.
thank
Good
you.
night.
Thank
This
you.
is
This has
always
been
the time that
wonderful.
we do this John Boy. I feel like the Waltons.
Well, we might as well say it. Good night.